The door at the Harlow farmhouse had not been locked in 40 years. Not once. Not even after the drought took the cattle and the bank took the east field. But when Hank Dillon rode up to it at noon on a Tuesday, with dust on his boots and fire in his chest, it was locked, bolted from the inside. He could hear boots scraping across the wooden floor, slow and deliberate, like whoever was behind that door was deciding something. He knocked again. 3 slow pounds. "Ruth," he said, "now open up. I won't stop until my child is in your womb." The words came out of him the way a river breaks through rock. Not violent, just certain. He had been carrying them for 3 days, all the way from the ridge where his foreman Lou Briggs had found him sitting on a fence post staring at nothing. And Lou had handed him a folded letter without a word and ridden away. The letter was from a lawyer in Abilene. It said the child Ruth had been carrying when she left 6 months ago had been lost, miscarried in her 2nd month, and that Ruth had not told Hank, and that Ruth did not intend to tell Hank. Hank was 70 years old, wide in the shoulders still, though the years had bent the corners of him. White at the temples, leather at the jaw, hands the size of small shovels. He had buried 1 wife, raised 2 sons who left for California and never wrote back, and built the Dillon Ranch from 40 acres of nothing into the biggest operating cattle spread in 3 counties. He was not a man who came undone easy. But Ruth was not an easy thing to be undone by. She was 38 years his junior, 6'1" in her bare feet, broad and strong and quiet in the way that still water is quiet. She had come to work the ranch as a hand 2 years ago, come with nothing but a bedroll and a reference from a rancher over in Lubbock, who said she could shoe a horse faster than any man he'd ever hired, and that he was sorry to lose her. Hank had hired her without a second thought and spent 6 months pretending he wasn't watching her work. She opened the door, not all the way, just enough to stand in the gap, one hand on the frame, filling it the way a mountain fills a horizon. She was wearing her work clothes, canvas trousers and a faded blue shirt, her dark hair pulled back rough. Her eyes were the color of creek water, gray-green and deep, and they looked at Hank without flinching. "You read the letter," she said. "Lou found it in the tack room. I don't know how it got there. I left it there by accident." She said it flat, no apology in it. "I meant to burn it. Ruth, don't. I'm not here to grieve at you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door and let him in. The farmhouse was small and clean. She had been renting it from old Pete Garner since she left the ranch. 12 acres of nothing much, a kitchen garden out back, a single horse in the lean-to. When the table had 2 chairs and a coffee pot and a clay mug she'd made herself. Badly lopsided, the kind of thing you keep anyway. Hank sat down without being asked. Ruth stood at the window with her back to him, looking out at the flat brown land. "I lost it at 9 weeks, she said. "Before I even told you I was carrying." "I know." So there was nothing to tell. There was something to tell. You left because of it. She turned around. Her face was doing something complicated, something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, something that lived in between. "I left because I'm 32 years old and you are 70, and I was terrified," she said. And then there was nothing to be terrified of anymore. And I was still gone. And I couldn't figure out how to come back from that. Hank put his hat on the table. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said. She looked at him. "I'm asking you to try again," he said. Deliberately, with your eyes open and mine open and both of us knowing what we're walking into. The coffee pot hissed on the stove. Outside a crow called once and went quiet. Ruth leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. She was not a woman who cried in front of people. Hank knew that. She was also not a woman who lied to herself. And that was the thing about her that had broken him open 2 years ago and still had not let go. "You're 70 years old, Hank. I know how old I am." "If this works," she said, and her voice was careful, holding something. "That child grows up with a father who is..." "Old," he said. "Yes, and still standing, and still here, which is more than most men half my age can say to their own children." Ruth looked at him for a long time. Then she walked to the table and picked up his hat and set it on the hook by the door, the way you do with a hat that belongs in a house. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make fresh coffee." Hank Dillon sat down. Outside, the wind came across the plain with the smell of rain 3 days out. The crow called again. The door stayed open. That was part one of how it started, or how it started again, depending on which version you believed. The version Hank told was simple. He rode up to a locked door and knocked until it opened. The version Ruth told, years later, when people asked, was different. She said the door wasn't locked at all. She said she had just been deciding how wide to open it. Both of them were telling the truth. Ruth Garner, as she had started calling herself after taking the lease on Pete Garner's 12 acres, was not a woman built for small spaces. Everything about her was wide, her shoulders, her stride, the way she looked at a problem. She had grown up on a working ranch outside of Amarillo, the second of 5 children, the only one who stayed when her parents died within 6 months of each other. She had run that spread alone for 3 years, before the bank decided her land was worth more to them than to her. And she had walked off it with a bedroll and a pair of good boots and exactly one direction in mind: forward. She had not planned on Hank Dillon. She had not planned on a lot of things. The morning after he knocked on her door, he was back at 6 in the morning with a truck full of cedar fence posts and 2 shovels, and no explanation. She came out of the farmhouse in her work clothes, coffee in hand, and looked at him. "You've got 40 feet of fence down on the south side," he said. "I noticed it when I rode in yesterday." "I've got 1 horse," Ruth said. "The fence is fine." "The fence is 40 feet of missing cedar on a property that backs up to open range." He got out of the truck. "You want that horse to stay, you need the fence." She drank her coffee. She watched him pull the first post out of the truck. "Like you're not doing this because of the horse," she said. "No," Hank said, "but the fence still needs doing." She got her gloves from inside and came and dug the first hole without another word. They worked through the morning without talking much, which was one of the things about them that had always fit like a good joint in wood. Hank Dillon was not a man who filled silence with noise. Ruth had spent most of her adult life being asked questions she didn't want to answer. So silence in a working man was not nothing to her. It was close to a gift. By noon, the fence was done, and they were sitting on the tailgate eating the sandwiches Hank had brought in a paper bag. And the sun was doing its full terrible best overhead. And Ruth said, "Tell me what this looks like to you, if it works." Hank finished chewing. He looked out at the flat land. "A kid who knows how to work," he said. "A mother who is the toughest person in any room she walks into. Land enough to learn on. Me for as long as I've got, which, according to Doc Warren, is more than you'd think." "Doc Warren told you that?" "Doc Warren told me my heart is in better shape than most 50-year-olds he sees, and my lungs are clear, and if I stay off whiskey, I've got a solid run ahead." "You're off whiskey?" "Since the letter." Ruth was quiet. She turned her sandwich over in her hands. "I'm scared," she said. and it cost her something to say it. You could tell from the way she said it flat and fast, the way you rip a bandage. "I know," Hank said. "Not of you," she said. "Of wanting this. Of wanting it, and then losing it again." The sandwich sat in her hands. Below the ridge, a hawk made a long, slow circle over nothing, and then rose and was gone. "I lost my wife," Hank said. "Eleanor, 19 years ago. I didn't think I'd survive it, and I did, which I was not grateful for at the time." He looked at his hands. "There's no arrangement that protects you from losing what you love. You know that. So does everybody who's ever lost something. You just decide anyway." Ruth looked at him for a long time. Then she took a bite of her sandwich. "I'm not moving back to the Dillon Ranch," she said. "I know. If this is going to be a thing, you move here." Hank looked around at the 12 acres of scrub and one lopsided horse paddock. "Move Pete Garner's land. I've got first right of purchase if Pete decides to sell. He's 81 and his kids are in Houston." She looked at him sideways. "The house needs work. The house needs to be torn down and rebuilt from the studs." "Yes," she said. "It does." Hank Dillon looked at the farmhouse. He looked at the fence they had just put in. He looked at Ruth, sitting on his tailgate, eating a sandwich in the noon heat without a single wasted motion. I'll call my contractor Monday," he said. Ruth nodded. She finished her sandwich. She hopped off the tailgate with the ease of someone who had never in her life thought twice about what her body could do. "You can stay for dinner," she said. "But you're sleeping in the truck." "That's fair," Hank said. It was fair. It was also the first time in 6 months that he had felt something loosen in his chest, some knot he hadn't known was there. He sat on the tailgate while Ruth walked back to the house and didn't bother pretending he wasn't watching. The hawk came back over the ridge. The fence posts stood clean and straight in the afternoon light. 4 weeks later, Pete Garner's daughter called from Houston to say her father had decided to sell. Calvin Briggs was 29 years old, tall and lean the way wire fencing is lean, and he had been working the Dillon Ranch since he was 17. His father, Lou Briggs, was Hank's foreman. Calvin had grown up between the ranch and his father's house, and considered Hank Dillon something between a boss and an uncle, and occasionally a force of weather. You didn't argue with Hank. You also didn't worry about him. He was Hank. So when Hank called a meeting of the full ranch staff and said he was moving off the property to the Garner place 12 miles south and that Lou was being given full operational authority of the Dillon spread, and that any man who had a problem with that was welcome to say so now. Calvin sat in the back of the room and watched the room not say anything. Afterward, Calvin walked out with his father. "You knew," Calvin said. "I knew something," Lou said. "Is he okay?" Lou looked at his son. Lou Briggs was 56, gray at the beard, quiet in the deep way of a man who had worked land his whole life and knew what it owed him, which was nothing. "He's better than okay," Lou said. "He's decided something. That's different from okay. That's the other thing." Calvin thought about that. "She's good people," Calvin said. He had met Ruth twice, both times at ranch supply runs. She had shaken his hand like she meant it, and asked smart questions about the Dillon herd and hadn't tried to be charming. Calvin respected that. "She's the best kind of people," Lou said. "The kind that doesn't need anything from you." Hank moved to the Garner place on a Friday in March. He brought his horse, his tools, 3 boxes of books, and a cast-iron skillet that had been Eleanor's and was the one object in the world he would not leave behind. Ruth met him in the driveway, and the contractor was already on site. The house was about to be gutted. "The skillet can go in the barn for now," Ruth said, looking at the cast iron. The skillet goes where I go, Hank said. Ruth looked at the skillet. She looked at Hank. Then you're both in the barn until the kitchen is rebuilt. That's fair, Hank said. And that was how Hank Dillon, at 70 years old, came to sleep in a barn on a cot for 6 weeks, cast iron skillet hanging on a nail above his head. He died while Ruth Garner slept in the farmhouse 50 yards away, and the contractor rebuilt everything between them into something worth living in. It was the best 6 weeks he'd had in 19 years. He didn't tell Ruth that. She probably knew anyway. The crew finished the kitchen first, because Ruth had specified it in the contract, and the morning it was done, she came into the barn at 5:30 with 2 mugs of coffee and said, "The stove works." Hank got up and took the skillet off the nail. They made eggs in the new kitchen in the early light and didn't talk much, and at some point Ruth said without preamble, "I made an appointment with Dr. Nora Calloway in Abilene. She's a specialist. She wants to do a full workup on both of us before we do anything deliberate." Hank turned the eggs. "Good," he said. "She's going to have questions," Ruth said. "I imagine so." "And opinions." "I imagine that too." Ruth drank her coffee. Outside, the sky was going pink and gold over the flat land. "She might say it can't be done," Ruth said. "She might," Hank said. "And then we'll figure out another way, if that's what you want." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "It's what I want," she said. "Simple as setting down a cup." Hank put the eggs on 2 plates and set them on the new kitchen table. Outside, Calvin Briggs was already in the truck at the end of the drive, and waiting to take Hank out to check the south pasture fence on the Dillon spread, which was apparently always needing something. Hank looked at the truck and looked at Ruth. "Go," she said. "I've got the garden to turn over." He went. The door stayed unlocked behind him. The appointment in Abilene was 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, Hank and Ruth built a fence line along the north border, turned over the kitchen garden, put 2 new windows in the east wall of the house, and had exactly 1 serious argument about the placement of the water trough, which Ruth won because she was right. Hank did not mind losing to Ruth when she was right. He had found that most people in his life had only ever argued with him to win. Ruth argued with him to solve the problem, which was a different thing entirely, and he had missed it more than he knew. The night before the Abilene appointment, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing out questions for the doctor. Hank sat across from her reading. At some point she looked up and said, "Are you afraid?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I'm past afraid. I'm in the part that comes after afraid." Ruth looked at him for a moment, then wrote something in her notebook. "What did you write?" he asked. "That," she said. Hank went back to his book. The lamp burned low. Outside, the prairie was wide and dark and full of wind. Doctor. Nora Calloway had an office in Abilene that was clean and organized, and had, on its windowsill, a cactus the size of a small child. Ruth noticed the cactus immediately. It was the kind of noticing that meant she was doing the thing she did when she was managing herself, which was to look at objects rather than at situations. Hank noticed Ruth noticing the cactus. Dr. Calloway was 50, small and direct, with the manner of someone who had spent 3 decades telling people hard things without enjoying it. She shook both their hands and sat across the desk and looked at the intake forms Hank and Ruth had filled out and said, without ceremony, "Let's talk about what you're here for and what's realistic." They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. The realistic part was harder than the possible part. Dr. Calloway was not discouraging. She was specific. There were considerations. There were options beyond what was obvious. There were paths Ruth's body might or might not take. There were questions about what they would do if those paths closed. Hank answered every question straight. Ruth answered every question straight. At some point, Dr. Calloway looked at both of them together and said, "Most couples I see in your situation spend half the appointment managing each other. You two aren't doing that." "We've got enough to manage without doing that," Ruth said. Dr. Calloway made a note. At the end, she said, "I want blood work from both of you today and a follow-up in 6 weeks. I'm not going to tell you this is impossible because it isn't. I'm going to tell you it requires patience and a clear head." "We've got both," Hank said. They had lunch at a diner on the main street, the kind of place with laminated menus and good pie. And they sat in a booth, and Ruth ate a full plate of chicken fried steak without speaking, and Hank had coffee and watched the street through the window, and eventually Ruth said, "She didn't say no." "She didn't say no," Hank agreed. "I expected her to say no." "I know you did." Ruth looked at her plate. She pushed the last piece of steak around with her fork in a small circle, which Hank had come to understand was the thing she did when she was working through something that mattered. "Then Hank," she said, "yeah. If this works." She stopped. Started again. "When this works, I want to name him after your father." Hank's father's name had been Wade. Hank looked out the window at the Abilene street, at the ordinary Tuesday of it, the trucks and the storefronts and the flat blue sky over everything. "Wade," he said. "Wade," Ruth said. "If it's a boy." "And if it's a girl?" Ruth almost smiled. Almost. "We'll figure that out when we get there." Hank drank his coffee. Wade Dillon. It settled somewhere in him the way the right fence post settles into good ground. Solid, already there. Outside the Abilene street went on being a Tuesday. Inside the diner, two people who had no business being what they were to each other sat in a booth and split a piece of pie and made a plan. The plan was simple. They were going to try. 6 weeks after Abilene, on a Wednesday morning when the sky was doing its early pink thing over the Garner land, Ruth Garner walked out of the farmhouse bathroom and stood in the kitchen doorway. Hank was at the stove. She didn't say anything for a moment. He turned around. She was holding a small white stick. She set it on the kitchen table between them without speaking. Hank looked at it. 2 lines. He sat down. Not because his legs gave, but because it was the kind of moment that should be received sitting. Ruth stayed standing. She was doing the thing with her jaw she did when she was holding something big, that slight forward set, that stillness. "It's early," she said. "Dr. Calloway said we don't." "I know," he said. 4 weeks, maybe. The blood work will tell us more." "I know." Ruth looked at him. "Hank." "I know," he said, again, softer. "I know." She sat down across from him. She put both hands flat on the table. Her hands were large and brown and capable of most things that needed doing in this life. And they were shaking very slightly, and she was letting him see that. He put his hands over hers. Outside, the sun came all the way up. The land went gold and wide. The single horse in the paddock moved along the fence line in its slow morning way, and the new kitchen was warm, and the cast-iron skillet was on the stove. And neither of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing to say that was bigger than the quiet. Calvin Briggs called at 7 to say the Dillon South pasture water line had a crack in it, and did Hank want him to call the plumber or handle it direct? Hank said, "Handle it direct," and hung up and looked at Ruth. "You need to eat something," she said. I was making eggs. Then make eggs. He got up and went back to the stove. Ruth sat at the table with her hands flat and the small white stick and the morning light coming through the new east windows. And Hank made eggs in Eleanor's cast-iron skillet. And somewhere between the first egg and the second, the shaking in her hands stopped. She noticed when it stopped. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. Dr. Calloway's office called at 9 to confirm the blood work appointment. Ruth took the call in the kitchen while Hank was out checking the fence line, standing at the new window with the phone to her ear and the kitchen garden visible out back. The turned soil dark and ready for whatever came next. Same time next Wednesday? The receptionist asked. Same time, Ruth said. She hung up. She looked at the garden. She thought about Wade. She thought about a girl's name that wasn't decided yet. She thought about Hank at the stove that morning, the particular straightness of his back, the way he had sat down when he saw the test, not because he was weak, but because the moment asked for it. She thought about a door she had almost not opened. The coffee pot hissed on the stove. Ruth Garner went outside to check on her horse. 8 months later, on a cold November morning with frost on the fence posts and the prairie flat and silver under a white sky, Wade Dillon came into the world at the Abilene Hospital at 6:14 in the morning, 7 pounds and loud about it. Hank Dillon was in the room. He had not left the building in 12 hours. And when the nurse put Wade in his arms, he stood very still for a moment. And then he looked at Ruth, who was watching him from the bed with her hair loose and her face stripped of everything that wasn't real. And he said very quietly, "Doctor, there he is." "There he is," Ruth said. Wade Dillon did not know yet that his father was 70 years old, or that his mother was the kind of woman who could rebuild a fence in the morning sun without stopping, or that the house he would grow up in had been torn down and rebuilt from the studs by a contractor named Fred who left a penny in the west wall for luck. He did not know about Abilene or the locked door or the letter Lou Briggs had found in the tack room. He didn't need to know any of that yet. Outside the hospital window, the November sky was clear and hard and going on forever, the way the plain sky does, like it has no interest in the small and particular things happening beneath it, like it simply endures. Hank sat down with the boy. Ruth closed her eyes. The word endures was wrong, actually. The sky didn't endure anything. It just was, wide and cold and present, the same as it had been the morning Ruth opened the door, and the same as it would be the morning Wade learned to walk, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Hank Dillon looked at his son's face. His son looked back. Outside, a crow called once and went quiet, and the frost on the fence posts caught the early light. And the Dillon land sat 12 miles south under the same sky it had always been under, wide and waiting and not finished yet.